helped, didn't it?
For me, yes. But I don't think it's something that Tracy would have done. But that's probably the people we are.
Did it drive you apart, the book, in a sense?
No, I think, strangely, the very fact that we were actually getting on quite badly at the beginning of my convalescence, drove me into writing the book, although it never began as a book. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I was driven very much into myself by my experience. I became quite isolated and internalised, and I was basically in shock, you know, I'm sure I was. And I found it very hard to just communicate with people, chit-chat and tittle-tattle and being on the phone to your mum. It just all seemed very hard to take, not seriously, but just
Did it seem trivial in a way?
Yes, precisely, yeah. And I found that this was getting in the way all the time, and I just realised there was so much inside me that was bottled up and that needed to come out. And I ended up thinking, well, at least if I could write it down, it might help. And it just started pouring out in no particular order. I just wrote down everything I could remember, exactly as I'd felt it. And it was a mess, just a mess of words, paper, word processor stuff.
But it helped the recovery process?
Yes, in the end, I think. And I realised that for me, personally, language was really central to understanding what had happened to me. I found that if I could explain it and nail it down with words, it would help me come to terms with it. And I found myself leafing through medical textbooks, learning words I would never, ever come across, like necrosis, infarction.
And words you'd hope never to come across in the future.
Of course, ischemia. You know, no one needs to know what these words mean, but they were all part of my disease. And
one thing that doesn't seem to have suffered, and we were talking about this before we began the recording, was your ambition in terms of your music.
Yeah.
That didn't suffer at all. So you were champing at the bit to get back.
Strangely, yes.
But with a new kind of music?
No, I just think...
Is it a new lease of life, in a way?
I mean, it sounds bizarre, I suppose, but I felt that I'd been a trouble to people by just being in hospital. It had just sort of got in the way a bit. And I thought the sooner I get out of there and just prove to people that it was nothing and I could just get back to work, then it would be better for everyone concerned and they could stop worrying about me. And I do remember getting home and thinking, you know, I really just want to pick up a guitar and start trying to write music again.
And it did work, didn't it?
Because no, not at the beginning.
Really?
No. In retrospect, I can look back and think what a pointless exercise it was at first. Because I mean, the first things that I wrote in the first 6-9 months of recovery were nothing to do with what I'd suffered. They were just generic pop songs with verses and choruses. I was doing it because I could.
You weren't saying anything particular?
Nothing.
There was no particular message?
No. And I showed it to a couple of close friends, and I mean, it took one of them just to say to me one night, this is just nothing. You know, there's nothing here. It works, it's got all the bits, but it's not saying anything.
But by '96 you were back, weren't you? You were winning awards, you were travelling, you were going on tour. Almost too many tours, weren't there? I
mean, it's easy to compress the last 3 or 4 years into just, you know, one halcyon moment of recovery and return. But it was longer than that. And we did have to go through a process of rebuilding and reminding ourselves what it was about our music that we liked. But, you know, when we did return, I think we realised that we wanted to reinvest the music with a greater kind of contemporary urgency, I think. And I'm sure that was in part to do with my state of mind, and that a harder edge to our music seemed more appropriate.
Because you'd become harder?
Not harder.
Both of you, you and Tracy.
Yes, but harder suggests something lacking in sensitivity. I think I just felt that we needed to dramatise our music with greater extremes, let's say.
You're the son of a jazz musician. Did you have music in your blood right from the start?
Yeah, for sure.
As a little boy, you wanted to play?
Yeah.
Picked up a guitar very early?
Yeah.
There was a club called Snoopy's, wasn't there?
Yes.
In Richmond.
Yes.
In South London.
Yeah.
Happy memories there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean...
That was your first break, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, my dad was keen for me to be a jazz musician, although he never ever pushed in that direction. He played me all sorts of stuff as I was growing up. But, you know, I was at the same time a product of the punk generation. You know, I was 13, 14, 15 during the punk years. And that was a really important moment for any teenager growing up at that point. It was a great moment of liberation and release. You felt that you could pick up a guitar and anyone could be in a band. You could play whatever you liked. And I think Snoopy's was very much a product of that period. It was just a local club in Richmond, hosting lots of local bands, all in the post-punk years, experimenting with all different kinds of music. And people think punk was just loud rock and roll. But in fact, in the years after punk, there was actually a really interesting vacuum where non-rock music was really encouraged. All those kind of macho kind of rock stereotypes of pre-punk had been blown out of the water. And everyone was experimenting with soul and jazz and dub and reggae. And Snoopy's was a real kind of melting pot for that in the kind of Kingston, Richmond area. And I just sort of tapped into it, really.
You went on to Hull University.
Yeah.
How did you meet Tracy? She was also there.
Well, Tracy was already in a band called the Marine Girls. And ironically, we were both signed to the same independent label in London called Cherry Red, basically just making tiny independent releases for virtually no money. And coincidentally, we were both given university places at Hull. We didn't know each other, even though we were on the same label.
Which came first in your relationship, music or love?
Just friendship and a love of the same music, I think. I mean, I went up to Hull and on my very first day at university, I went over to the Student Union building and I actually paged Tracy over the tannoy system. And I just said quite bluntly, I said, if Tracy of the Marine Girls is in the building, could she come up to reception?
You did it yourself or you got the porter to do it?
Oh, well, I got the porter to do it.
You hadn't got the courage? You were nervous?
I just don't think that was the way you did it, actually. And she came up the stairs a few minutes later. And I said, do you know who I am? And she said, no, but I think you're Ben Watt because someone's told me you were going to be here. And I just said, have you brought your guitar? And that was really how we met. And I think we were bonded together by the fact that we just thought we were different from everybody else. We thought we were, you know, up from London, you know, we knew all the hit records, you know, we were in bands. It was us versus them from very early on, and I don't think that's ever gone away.
And Everything But the Girl, how did the name come about?
That was a joke. It really was.
It's been a good joke, hasn't it? It's been a lasting joke.
I think, I mean, the point was that it was suggested that we might get together for just a one-off record. That was really the plan. Tracy had no intention of disbanding her group, and I was going to carry on with my solo stuff. And we just decided to choose a sort of throwaway, disposable name. And there was a shop in Hull which sold this antiquated, post-war bridal furniture. It was a hilarious shop. Everyone thought it was a standing joke in the town. And it was called Everything But the Girl. It had this kind of sort of American department store slogan. They could sell you everything to make your home complete, except the girl. And we just chose this name. It seemed completely trashy.
And now you've got two girls of your own, two twin girls, 18 months old.
Yeah, we have kids.
And Tracy
yeah.
could give up, but you want to go on.
Well, you know, she's in her mid-30s now, and I think, you know, hormonally, something's saying to her inside, you know, be a mum, be a mum. And she's really responding to that, and she's totally dedicated to the kids and bringing them up, and she wants to do right by them. But I mean, I suppose I'm in part cursed with the usual blokish drive and ambition that never seems to go away. And
but you've got your recording studio at home in North London.
That helps.
And some tolerant neighbours.
Some tolerant neighbours, yeah.
More or less tolerant
Yeah,
neighbours.
no, we've got... The studio's not fully soundproofed, and I always worry about the guy who lives through the wall because all the sound from my studio travels up the chimney breast into his house, and he's an opera buff, and I think he's from Eastern Europe. And I went up to him in the street, and I said to him recently, I said, "Does all this music drive you mad?" And he said, "Oh no," he said, "from time to time I like a good disco beat."
Ben Watt, I hope everybody likes the new album. Hope it's a big
thank you very
success.
much.
Thank you very much for being on the programme.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Sure.